It is not yet fully light on a hillside in southern Japan, in the autumn of 1877, and on the high ground stand a few hundred men who already know how this ends. They are swordsmen, some of the last true swordsmen of their kind, the survivors of an army that has been chased and starved and whittled down for months, cornered now on this small rise above the city of Kagoshima. Below them, in the gray half-dark, waits the other army, and the other army is enormous. Tens of thousands of soldiers, ringed all the way around the hill, dug in behind earthworks, with modern rifles and artillery, and gunboats out in the bay lobbing shells up onto the slope. Most of those soldiers are young. Many of them are the sons of farmers, conscripts, ordinary men handed a uniform and a rifle and taught to use it. And the men on the hill, the swordsmen, are the very class those farmers' sons were, until very recently, forbidden even to look at the wrong way. In a few hours, when the sun is properly up, that great modern army is going to advance up this hill, and it is going to end the age of the samurai. Not in a poem, not in a legend. Here, on this specific muddy slope, with rifles and cannon, on a real morning you could have marked on a calendar. And at the center of the doomed few hundred is a huge, heavy-browed man, gravely wounded, who is not some wild-eyed reactionary raging against the modern world. He is one of the men who built the modern world he is about to die fighting. That is the part the films never tell you. So let me tell you. Hello, my name's Aiden, and before we climb that hill together, I owe you an honest word about who's talking. I'm not Japanese. I'm a Westerner who fell for Japan the way you fall down a flight of stairs all at once, and it hurt, and I never quite got up. I spent a few years living in Kyoto, mangling the language, bowing at the wrong moments, being quietly rescued from my own mistakes by people far more gracious than I had any right to expect. And of all the stories that country holds, the one I'm going to tell you today is the one I most often see people get completely, beautifully, cinematically wrong, because you probably already have a picture in your head of the last samurai. And I'd bet a great deal that the picture came from a film, a noble warrior in lacquered armor, a wise and gentle rebel who rejects the guns and the railways of the modern age, and crucially, a heroic American, a Western soldier who wanders in, learns the way of the sword and fights and very nearly dies at the samurai's side. It's a gorgeous film. I've watched it more times than I'll admit, and it is, as history, almost entirely made up. So what I want to do today is set the movie gently to one side and walk you through what actually happened to the real last samurai, a man named Saigo Takamori, because the true story has no invented Western hero in it at all, and it is stranger and sadder, and to my mind far more moving, than anything Hollywood put on the screen. And I'll flag, as I always try to, where the record is solid, and where even the historians are still arguing. I'll say one more thing before we start, because I think it's the key that unlocks the whole story. The real last samurai was not fighting to keep the modern world out of Japan. He had already helped bring the modern world in, and once you understand that, once you sit with that contradiction, everything about his life and his death, and why an entire nation still loves him, starts to make a deeper kind of sense. Let's start by being fair to the film and clear about what it is. There's a well-known Hollywood movie from 2003 called The Last Samurai. In it, a battered American officer is hired to help Japan's new government modernize its army, is captured by a band of traditional samurai, comes to admire their discipline and honor and their harmony with nature, and eventually fights alongside them in a last, doomed, magnificent charge against the modern conscript army. Samurai on horseback with swords and bows, riding into rifle fire and cannon. It's beautifully made. The costumes, the landscapes, the sense of a vanishing world, a lot of it is done with real love. But I need to say this plainly and kindly because it changes everything about how you understand what really happened. That American officer did not exist. There was no Western hero at the heart of the last samurai story. The whole white outsider who becomes one of them arc is an invention, a fictional composite bolted on so that a Western audience would have someone to ride in with. The real rebellion was an entirely Japanese story, fought and lost by Japanese people, over Japanese questions, and there was no foreigner standing in the middle of it learning the way of the sword. And the real leader of that rebellion was not a mystical hermit who hated technology and wanted to freeze Japan in the past. He was one of the most powerful statesmen in the entire country. He was, in fact, one of the men who had personally torn the old Japan down. To understand him, you have to understand the astonishing thing that had just happened to his country. Because Japan, in these years, was living through one of the fastest, most total transformations any nation has ever put itself through. For roughly 2.5 centuries, Japan had been ruled by the shogun, a military government, with the emperor kept up in Kyoto as a revered but largely ceremonial figure. Society was frozen into rigid hereditary classes, and at the top of that order sat the samurai, the warrior class, with the right to carry 2 swords supported by hereditary stipends, a kind of inherited salary paid to them for belonging to the caste that fought. To be born a samurai was to be born into an identity, a rank, a way of moving through the world that had been fixed for generations. Then, in 1868, that whole order was overthrown. A coalition of powerful domains rose up, swept the last shogun aside, and formally restored power to the young emperor, the event we call the Meiji Restoration. And the men who led it had looked hard at the wider world, at the Western warships and industry that had recently forced Japan open, and they had reached a cold, clear-eyed conclusion. Modernize, fast, on our own terms, or be carved up like so much of the rest of the world was being carved up. So they set about remaking Japan at breathtaking speed, a modern conscript army, railways, telegraphs, factories, a Western-style state, all in a handful of years. And here is the wrenching irony sitting at the very heart of our story. Among the leaders of that revolution, among the men who overthrew the shogun and built the new Japan, was Saigo Takamori. He wasn't a bystander to the modern age. He was one of its architects. So let me introduce him properly, because he is one of the most beloved and most complicated figures in all of Japanese history. Saigo Takamori was a samurai from the southern domain of Satsuma, a big, powerful region at the bottom of the island of Kyushu, centered on the city of Kagoshima. Satsuma samurai had a reputation, proud, martial, fiercely loyal to their own. And Saigo was, by every account, physically enormous for his day, with a broad face and huge eyes, a commanding, almost overwhelming presence, and a personality that drew people to him with extraordinary force. Men followed him, not because they feared him, but because they loved him. He had a reputation for sincerity, for plain living, for caring more about principle and loyalty than about money or comfort. And in the years around the Restoration, he was right at the center of everything. He was one of the senior leaders of the Satsuma forces that helped bring down the shogunate. He held high office in the new imperial government. He was, for a time, one of the most influential men in the country, a founder, a hero of the new order, a maker of modern Japan. If the story had ended there, he'd simply be one of the great builders of the nation. But it didn't end there, because the new Japan that Saigo had helped create began, almost immediately, to do something that broke his heart, and the hearts of hundreds of thousands of men like him. It began to abolish the samurai. And this is the piece that the films flatten into a costume drama, when it's really one of the most poignant social upheavals imaginable. Try to feel it from the inside. The new government understood correctly that a modern nation could not run on a hereditary warrior caste. You cannot build a modern army out of a closed hereditary class of swordsmen when your rivals have mass conscript armies with rifles. You cannot run a modern economy while paying stipends out of the state's own pocket to a whole class of people for the accident of their birth. So methodically, over several years, the Meiji government dismantled the samurai as a class. It stripped away their special legal status. It built a new national army by conscription, drafting ordinary commoners, the sons of farmers and townsmen, the very people the samurai had always stood above. It phased out and eventually cut off the hereditary stipends, the inherited income that had supported samurai families for generations, converting them into far less, and leaving a great many proud families suddenly poor. And then, in 1876, came the edict that landed like a slap on the soul. The Haitorei, the order that banned the wearing of swords in public. Sit with that one for a moment. For a samurai, the two swords weren't a weapon you kept in a cupboard. They were worn. They were who you were, visible on your hip, the mark of your rank, your history, your very self, carried through the street for everyone to see. And now the government, the same government some of these men had bled to install, told them they could no longer wear them. In a single stroke, a whole caste was told that the thing that made them themselves was, from now on, illegal to show in public. Their status gone, their income gone, their swords off. Imagine an entire class of people, hundreds of thousands of them, with a heritage stretching back centuries, waking up over the course of a few years to discover that the world had simply deleted the role they were born to play. Not just their jobs, their identity. That is the pressure that had been building across Japan. And in Satsuma, in Saigo's home, it was building highest of all, because Saigo himself had, by this point, walked away from the government. The exact reasons are debated by historians, and I want to be honest that a great deal about Saigo's inner motives is genuinely argued over rather than settled. But the broad shape is clear enough. He had fallen out badly with the other leaders over the direction of the new state, famously over a bitter dispute about policy toward Korea, and more deeply over what he saw as the drift, the corruption, the forgetting of the old virtues of loyalty and sincerity that he prized above almost everything. He felt, I think it's fair to say, that the revolution he'd helped make had lost its soul, so he resigned his high offices and went home, back to Satsuma, back to Kagoshima, and there he did something that would prove enormously consequential. He set up schools, private academies for young men, for exactly the kind of disaffected, displaced, proud young samurai who were seething across the region, their futures canceled, their swords banned, their stipends cut. These schools taught military skills and Confucian learning, and, one imagines, a certain fierce nostalgia for the values they all felt slipping away. Saigo may have intended them as somewhere to channel all that dangerous energy productively, but what he had actually built, without perhaps fully meaning to, was a gathered, trained, armed, and bitterly frustrated body of young men who revered him utterly. sitting in a region that already resented the central government more than anywhere else in Japan. And you have to understand how unusual Satsuma was, to see why the powder was drier there than anywhere else. This was a domain with a huge population of samurai. A far greater share of its people belonged to the warrior class than in most of Japan, and a long, proud tradition of doing things its own way, of keeping the central government at arm's length. So the abolition of the samurai didn't land on Satsuma as an abstract policy from a distant capital. It landed on tens of thousands of local men, all at once, as a personal insult and a practical ruin. And it landed in a place that had the numbers, the weapons, the training, and the pride to do something about it. Add to that a leader like Saigo, the most respected man in the province, home from the capital and known to be disillusioned, and you can see how the region became something close to a state within a state, drifting further from the government's grip with every passing month. It was a barrel of powder, and Saigo, whether he liked it or not, was sitting on top of it. In early 1877, it went off. The immediate spark involved the government trying to quietly remove weapons and munitions from Satsuma, moving arms out of the region, because officials, quite rightly, were nervous about what was brewing there. Saigo's young followers, hearing of it, were enraged. Some of them seized the arsenals themselves. There were reports, too, of government agents sent to keep an eye on Saigo, which his men took as proof of worse intentions. The details are tangled, and here again the historians debate exactly how much was planned and how much simply spiraled. But the effect was that Saigo's academies erupted into open revolt against the imperial government. And here is a detail I find almost unbearably human. By most accounts, Saigo did not start this. He was away when it kicked off, and the picture that comes down to us is of a man returning to find that his young men had already lit the fire, and then choosing, reluctantly, to stand at their head, whether he led out of genuine conviction, or out of loyalty to the boys who worshipped him, or out of a sense that the thing was now unstoppable, and he could not abandon them to it. That, too, is disputed, and I won't pretend to know his heart. But the man who took command of the Satsuma Rebellion was, it seems, in some real sense swept up into leading it, rather than a schemer who had planned it all along. He put himself at the front of a rebellion he may well have known could not be won. And so, in the early months of 1877, an army of Satsuma samurai, tens of thousands strong at its height, marched north, out of Kagoshima, with Saigo at its head, to challenge the modern state he had helped to build. And it's right here that the movie image really falls apart, because I want to correct something that almost everyone gets wrong, myself included, for years. This was not a war of noble swordsmen refusing to touch a gun, riding gloriously into rifle fire on principle. That's the cinematic version, and it makes for a stunning scene, but it isn't what happened. The Satsuma rebels were samurai, yes, and the sword mattered enormously to them, culturally and personally and in the close, brutal fighting. But they also carried firearms. They used rifles and artillery of their own. This was, for the most part, a modern war fought by both sides with modern weapons. It's just that one side had far more of everything, and a whole industrial state behind it, and the other did not. The tragedy wasn't swords against guns. The tragedy was a brave, outnumbered, undersupplied force against the full weight of a modern nation-state. The rebel army marched north and ran straight into a wall, quite literally. They laid siege to Kumamoto Castle, a great fortress held by a government garrison, and the castle held. The rebels threw themselves at it and could not take it, and the siege dragged on, burning up precious weeks and precious ammunition and precious men. That long stalemate at Kumamoto was, in a real sense, where the rebellion was lost, because while the Satsuma army was pinned there, unable to break through, the government did the one thing the rebels could not match. It poured in reinforcements. And this is where the sheer arithmetic of a modern state starts to tell. A rebellion runs on what it can carry and what it can seize. A national government runs on factories and arsenals and railways and ships, and the power to conscript fresh men by the tens of thousands and send them south in an endless stream. The rebels could win battles, and they did, some of them ferocious and hard-fought, but they could not replace what those battles cost them. Every rifle lost, every barrel of powder spent, every man who fell was gone for good. The government could lose the same things 10 times over and simply send more. That is the quiet, unglamorous machinery that decides most wars, long before anyone reaches a final heroic hill. Not courage, supply. And on supply, the rebellion was doomed almost from the day it began. And here is the deep, aching heart of the whole story, the thing the real history says that no film quite dares to. The army that was sent to crush Saigo, the samurai's samurai, was made largely of conscripts, ordinary commoners, peasant boys and townsmen drafted into the new national army, trained for months rather than raised from birth to the sword, equipped with modern rifles and backed by artillery and a modern supply system, and the industrial resources of the whole state. The very men the samurai class had looked down on for centuries, the farmers, the nobodies, were now the soldiers grinding the last samurai army into the dirt. Think about what that meant, symbolically, for a man like Saigo. His entire life had been built on the idea that the warrior was born, not made, that there was something in the blood, and the training and the code of the samurai that ordinary men simply did not have. And the new Japan he had helped create was proving, on the battlefield in his own blood, that this was no longer true, that a farmer's son with a rifle and a few months' drill could stand in a line and defeat the finest swordsman in the province. The future he had helped bring into being was killing him, and it was doing it with the hands of the very people the old world had despised. Slowly, remorselessly, the rebels were pushed back, beaten at Kumamoto, worn down in battle after battle, out of supplies, out of ammunition, their numbers bleeding away. They were driven back south, back the long, bitter way they had come, back toward Kagoshima, where it had all begun. By the end, Saigo's tens of thousands had been reduced to a few hundred, a last loyal, exhausted remnant, most of their firearms and ammunition gone, falling back at last on the swords, not out of some pure warrior philosophy, but because it was, quite simply, what they had left. Which brings us back at last to that hillside at dawn. Shiroyama, Castle Mountain, a rise overlooking Kagoshima, Saigo's own city, the place he had come home to. By September of 1877, the last few hundred of Saigo's followers were dug in on that hill, completely surrounded. The government forces around them numbered in the tens of thousands. The outcome was not in any doubt at all, and every man on that hill knew it. In the last days, the government commander, who had, in an earlier life, known Saigo, as so many of them had, because these men had once been comrades, is said to have sent word offering him a chance to surrender. Saigo did not take it. They spent what they must have known was their last night. Some accounts say, quietly drinking, talking together, in the way of men who have run entirely out of tomorrow. And at dawn the imperial army began the final assault. Artillery, rifle volleys pouring up the slope, the naval guns out in the bay. The last samurai came down off that hill and into the fire in a final desperate advance, and they were cut down, one after another, until almost none of them were left. And Saigo Takamori died there, on the slopes of Shiroyama. Now, and this matters to me, so let me be careful and honest with you. Exactly how he died is one of the things the record does not settle cleanly, and you should be suspicious of anyone who tells it to you with total certainty. The most famous and cherished version, the one woven deep into how Japan remembers him, is that Saigo, gravely wounded in the fighting, chose to end his own life in the traditional way, seppuku, ritual suicide, with a loyal retainer at his side to help him make a dignified end rather than be taken. It is a powerful, fitting image, and it may well be true, but other accounts suggest he may simply have been struck down by his battle wounds, mortally hit in the chaos, and that the beautiful ritual version grew up around him afterwards because it was the death the nation needed him to have had. Which of these is the literal truth? We genuinely do not know for certain, and I'd rather stand here and tell you we're not sure than hand you a stirring scene dressed up as a settled fact. What is beyond dispute is that he died there on that hill with the last of his men, and that when he fell, the age of the samurai fell with him. The rebellion was over. There would never be another like it. Some 7 centuries of warrior rule in Japan ended, for good, on that specific slope. And then something happened that I think is the single most extraordinary turn in the whole story. The thing that tells you Saigo was never really the villain of Japan's modernization, but its conscience. You might expect the government to have buried the memory of the man who led the largest rebellion against it, to brand him a traitor, erase him, move on. And officially, for a little while, that's what he was, a rebel against the state, defeated and dead. But the country would not let him go. Within just a handful of years, the same government he had risen against formally pardoned him. Posthumously, officially, they cleared his name, because ordinary Japanese people had never really stopped loving him. They understood, somehow, that Saigo had not rebelled out of greed or ambition, but out of loyalty to a set of values he felt the new age was trampling: sincerity, duty, care for the men who followed him. He came to stand for a kind of pure, self-sacrificing devotion that a fast-modernizing, money-minded nation was already afraid it was losing. And so he was rehabilitated not as a rebel but as a hero. A tragic, noble, deeply beloved hero. If you go to Tokyo today to Ueno Park, you can stand in front of a famous bronze statue of him, a big, sturdy man in a plain kimono walking his dog, utterly unpretentious. Not a warlord on a rearing horse, a man out for a walk. That is how the nation that defeated him chose in the end to remember him, not as an enemy, but as something closer to a beloved uncle. The man who fought the modern Japan, honored at the heart of the modern Japan. I find that almost impossibly moving. A country strong enough and wise enough to hold both truths at once, that he had to lose, and that he was right to be mourned. So let's set the real man beside the movie one last time, gently, because you deserve the true picture to carry away with you. The film gives you a mystical warrior culture living in harmony with nature, rejecting the gun on principle, saved and witnessed by a heroic Western outsider. The history gives you something quieter and harder and, to me, far more affecting. It gives you Saigo Takamori, not a hermit purist, but one of the chief builders of modern Japan, a statesman and a general, a man who used guns and understood the modern world perfectly well, who turned against the very nation he had made because he could not bear what it was doing to the people and the principles he loved. It gives you a rebellion fought with rifles on both sides, lost at a castle siege, and ended by an army of the common men the samurai had always looked down upon. It gives you a death we can't even be certain about the manner of. And it gives you no Western hero at all because there wasn't one, and there didn't need to be one. And the story is so much better without him. The real last samurai wasn't a man fighting to stop the future. He was a man who had helped build the future, and then could not live inside it. And that's the part I sit with, long after the battle's over, and it's why this story has never let me go. Because there's something almost universally human buried in it. Saigo spent his best years tearing down an old world that he decided had to fall, and then he gave his life fighting for the very things that old world had carried. He was, in a way, in mourning for something he himself had helped to kill. And I don't think that's a peculiarly Japanese predicament, or a peculiarly 19th century one. I think it's one of the oldest aches there is, because we all do a smaller version of it, don't we? We push for the new thing, the new job, the new city, the new life, the change we're sure we want, and we help pull down the old one to get it. And then, standing in the future we asked for, we find ourselves aching for something the old world had that the new one somehow doesn't. Some texture, some closeness, some way of being that we didn't know we were trading away until it was already gone. We are so often the ones who dismantled the very thing we end up grieving. That, I think, is what people are really reaching for when they cling to a vanishing world. Whether it's the samurai, or a disappearing craft, or the town you grew up in, or a way of life that's slipping under. It isn't simple nostalgia, and it isn't a refusal to move forward. It's the very human grief of understanding that progress is real and necessary, and that it still costs something precious, and that sometimes the person mourning the loss most deeply is the very person who helped bring it about. Saigo rode down that hill into the guns of the world he'd made, and a whole nation decided in the end that a man could be wrong to rebel and right to be loved, both at once. I think there's a great, generous wisdom in that. The wisdom to honor the thing you had to leave behind. So that's what I genuinely love to hear from you, and I do read the comments. I read as many as I possibly can. Is there something in your own life that you help change or leave or let go of for good reasons, real reasons, and still find yourself quietly missing? A place, a way of living, a younger version of yourself. I'm not asking whether you'd undo it. I'm asking what you honor now about the thing that's gone. Tell me down below. I mean it. And listen, I've said a good few Japanese names tonight, and I promise you I've bruised some of them. Somewhere my old friend Kenji is quietly wincing at my pronunciation, or so I'm told. He spent years patiently fixing my vowels, and I still let him down. If you know this history better than I do, and many of you will, come and correct me kindly in the comments. That's how I keep getting closer to the truth of a country that isn't mine. I still remember my old landlady in Kyoto, who once found me watching that very film and simply smiled at me. The patient smile of someone watching a foreigner love her country slightly wrong and letting him, because at least he was loving it. I've spent a long time since then trying to earn a better smile. This story is part of that. If you want more of the real history under the beautiful cinematic surface, the true stories told with as much care as an outsider can manage, then subscribe and stay with me a while. There's so much more of this world I want to show you. My name's Aiden. Thank you for climbing the hill with me, and I'll see you in the floating world.